Good morning, everyone. This is Tom Still from the Wisconsin Technology Council, and thank you for joining us today for the latest in our series, Crossing the Coronavirus Chasm. Today's topic is the case for emerging and diverse fund managers. We've got a great lineup to talk about that, and I'm going to get to that in a bit, but I first would like to introduce Pete Delcamera. Pete's the Chief Technical Officer at Kimberly-Clark, KC. And talk about a Wisconsin icon, right? I mean, that's a company that has been doing some great things. And Pete, I want you to tell us a little bit about KC and why you're taking part in today's seminar.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, as Tom said, my name is Pete Delcamera, and I serve as the Chief Scientist for Kimberly-Clark. And our vision is to lead the world in essentials for a better life. And I believe there's nothing more essential than achieving social justice by ending racism and achieving gender equality. And if you go to the next slide, I have a question for every single one of you. If in the 1960s, we could go from the Earth to the moon in less than a decade, why can't we achieve social justice by ending racism and achieving gender equality by the end of this decade, by 2030? I know that's a bold ambition, but so was going to the moon. And so I have a question for all of you, which is, if you want to change the world, all you really need to do is to change your mind. And Tom, really, that's all I really wanted to say today. I'll turn it back over to you and to this distinguished panel so that we can get right into the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pete. Brief but powerful, and certainly timely with everything that's been going on. Before I talk a little more about the rest of our guests here, just a little bit of background on why we're doing this. There's been some things. I'm looking here at Eric Iverson, who's a part of this, and Eric and his team at WARF have been a part of another process called the Endless Frontier, Shaping the Endless Frontier, in which we started with someone from the University of Michigan and other parts who made the point in a couple of times that the Midwest doesn't look all that good when it comes to equality, especially around economic equality. In fact, there are others have noted that we could do a lot better, and it's the same in much of the Midwest. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I think the notion of diverse fund managers is a big part of it, because that can reach into communities that otherwise perhaps have not been touched. And so the folks we have here assembled today can really talk a lot more about that in depth. So Jason Fields is with us. He's still, for the time being, a member of the Wisconsin legislature, but he chose not to run again, but he's so active in so many other things in the community and in the private sector. He's the managing director at Dark Knight Capital Ventures. He's worked in the financial sector a lot over time. He's actually written 5 books, and so he's a prolific writer as well. So thank you for joining us here today, Jason. And Eric Iverson, I alluded to Eric before. He is the CEO for WARF. That's the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, and they have been very active in so many things, certainly around intellectual property coming off the UW-Madison campus, and through WISIS, which is affiliated with WARF, all of the other comprehensive campuses around the state, except for the UW-Milwaukee, which has its own organization. And so he has been in and around venture capital, research, and much more over time. So welcome, Eric. Will Martin. Will is the CEO and president for the Badger State Opportunity Fund. It's Wisconsin's first statewide multi-assets qualified opportunity fund. And so you probably heard a lot about opportunity funds, but here's where we get to hear a little more about how they actually work. And Will's been involved in state government. He's traveled the state broadly and knows what's out there and what's available and what's not available. So welcome, Will Martin. And then last but not least, Corey Nettles. Corey is the founder of Generation Growth Capital. It's a private equity fund, mostly around buyouts and M&A. He's also an attorney. He served as secretary of the Wisconsin Department of Commerce, and that's where Corey and I first got to know one another, because he was really one of the fathers of the qualified new business venture law in Wisconsin. Something we push for a lot at the Tech Council, but Corey and the late Senator Ted Canavas were very important in pushing that over the goal line. And that's been one of the things that I think has helped propel the Wisconsin investment community, particularly around angel and venture, for a long time. So, thanks for joining us, Corey. So I'm going to turn it over now to Corey and Jason to move through some slides that help really to better define the emerging managers program that they have envisioned. And so we're going to go take it from there, then hopefully have a great conversation. And we want to hear from others who are online as well. Okay, thank you. And Corey and Jason.
Hey, thank you, Corey. Like always, I know I said I want you to come in, but you being the father of a lot of this, and would you like to do the intro and just tell people how long you've done this and where we've come?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jason. To say I'm the father of this or the QD law makes me feel older than I am. I certainly have been around the emerging manager, minority manager conversation for, 15, 17 years or so now, dating back to my time at the Department of Commerce in 2003. There's a very strong case, especially across the country, a strong and well-documented case about the success of investing with emerging managers and minority managers. Those things are not synonymous, but they're related. And part of what we hope to do today is to tell that story about these programs that have existed successfully across the country, and to continue to make the case for us figuring out here in Wisconsin how to finally move forward with an emerging manager, minority manager program. As the data will demonstrate, the performance is outsized, and we think it's a very compelling case, and we look forward to talking about that. Back to you, Jason.
Hey, thanks, Corey. And Tom, let me say thank you, because I couldn't put together a better panel. Knowing all of these guys, Corey and Will, for quite some time, like brothers, and then meeting who I now call my brother, Pete Dolkemeyer, who you'll see some of his slides are incorporated in this, and then getting a chance to meet Eric. I'm going to go through these slides, Tom, because I would love for us to really get into the discussion of this. At one slide, I will ask for each of the guys to touch on their funds, strategies, and things of that nature, just as an introduction. And Angela, if we could go to the next slide. So as we get to discussing diverse and emerging managers, I think there's something we need to differentiate between the two. Typically, an emerging manager is typically capped at $1 billion. And so when we say emerging managers, it's usually titled as how many assets under management, or how big is the fund. And usually that's capped at $1 billion until you get out of that emerging manager space. It may vary a little bit, but for the most part, an emerging manager is anyone who is under $1 billion or $1 billion fund. On the other side of that, we're talking about diverse managers. And we have to point out that a diverse manager can be an emerging manager, not necessarily a diverse manager. When we say diverse managers, we're really talking about people of color, women, cervical disabled veterans. We're really talking about targeted demographics of individuals who are not heavily funded in this space, or you don't see a lot of top level managers in that space. And so it's best for us to differentiate between a diverse and emerging manager. Again, an emerging manager capped at $1 billion. An emerging manager is not necessarily a diverse manager. When we say diverse manager, we're usually talking about women, people of color, service disabled veterans, people in those demographics. Next slide, please. Here is the point that we're trying to make, and we'll get into some of this, why we think this is vitally important, that Wisconsin begins to look, and as Eric said in a discussion one day, we need to begin to change the narrative. And I'm glad Eric had pointed out to that, as well as Pete. When we look at founders, money managers, entrepreneurs, we see that number one, there is a lack of underrepresented capital or managers in these spaces, whether that's the venture capital space, whether that's the private equity space, whether that's the opportunity zone fund space with Bill. There is a lack, and you can see that if that slide was blown up, I'm not sure if you all can see it, but for the most part, when we look at 1% of capital is typically funded towards African Americans. You can then see 1.3%, I believe that is, for Latinos, 2.4% for Hispanics. So as we look to change the narrative, one of the questions or things that we need to answer is, where's the capital being deployed, who's receiving it, and how, again, do we change the narrative? And that's from a sort of diverse and emerging managers perspective. The graph underneath that then breaks it down into gender. Going all the way from 2009 to 2019, you can look and see that there's a huge discrepancy between female founders and male founders. And again, if we really want to change the narrative in this day and age, we have to explore how do we change this paradigm by implementing emerging and diverse managers programs. Next slide, Angela. And here's where I'll yield to Corey because his private equity experience and his track record can really speak to this chart here.
So thanks, Jason, whenever I've entered this conversation about supporting emerging manager programs, the first question I always get, or the concern we always get, is appropriately, what's the performance? And the assumption too often is that emerging managers and minority managers or diverse managers underperform their peer counterparts. And if you actually look at the data, the exact opposite is true. Emerging managers and diverse managers substantially outperform their non-diverse counterparts. And that's what this data here is showing. And that's true across all asset classes. If you see up in the upper left-hand corner, you've got outperformance shown there. If you look in my space, in the private equity space, you can see across the board, NAIC firms are diverse firms. That's the National Association of Investors Council. Those are all ethnically diverse firms. You can see what their IRR looks like and what their net IRRs look like compared to their non-diverse peers. Up in the upper right-hand side, you see fixed income, and then in the lower right-hand side, you see hedge. So the point is that these emerging managers and diverse managers have substantial outsized performance. There's lots of theories about why that is so, and we won't get into that debate today, but the data is fairly clear and compelling and consistent over a long period of time that you have this outer performance. In addition to being a diverse fund manager, I've had the pleasure of being investment committee chair in a fiduciary capacity over billions of dollars in assets. And whenever we've talked about adding diverse managers to our portfolio, someone on the investment committee always raises our sacrosanct fiduciary duty. It's my contention that when you look at this outperformance by diverse managers, we're actually in violation of our fiduciary duty if we don't work harder to get these managers into our portfolio because their outer performance is so compelling. So as we're thinking about these initiatives supporting emerging and diverse managers, I hope that we all come away from this with clarity around what the data says about the outer performance in general across all asset classes.
Okay.
Jason, I'll toss it back to you, or if there are others who want to comment on that page.
All right. Thank you, Corey. Angela, if you would, next slide, please. And so what we've done is compiled just a list of public, private sector entities, government entities that have these emerging manager programs. One of the things that we've always wanted to point out is that this stuff works. There are other people that are doing it. And when you look at the list of people engaging in this, you can see that it's a well thought out, well diverse list. Newberger Berman has an emerging managers program. The Teacher Retirement System of Texas has both an emerging and diverse managers program. The state of Illinois, and we're seeing financial companies now, from Morgan Stanley to Allstate, Credit Suisse, Prudential, where they're also getting into the space of having emerging managers come in and sort of work as a fund of funds model within their organization to manage funds in asset classes. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that I want to touch on, and Tom, I mentioned this briefly with you and I, is that there are sort of two things that we're discussing right now. There is a government fund of funds model. Many of you have heard of the Badger fund of funds model, so you have that. What I also ran into was when I'm talking to a lot of the business entities, bankers, other major corporations, that they also would like to not get in on this, but they would like to be supportive, but they're not really sold on a government-backed fund of funds model. And so one of the people that I think is doing a good job here is Carrie Thome of NVNG Investors, and she's launching a venture capital fund of funds program with her goal is to go to the corporate sector here in Wisconsin and begin to have a privately backed fund of funds model. And so I think what we're looking at here is the potential for us in Wisconsin. Again, if we really want to begin to change the narrative, become more diverse, become more competitive globally, then we should be looking at both of these models. And so if you look on this slide, you'll see Michigan has a fund of funds model, Ohio has a fund of fund model. And I want to thank Pete, because Pete gave me the opportunity to talk with the guys from Renaissance, and we've learned a great deal about what they're doing, with the things that he and I want to see, centrifuge. And so this would be the first VC venture fund of funds program here. And again, I think when you look at that, we need to make sure we're exploring the government side as well as the private based side, because I think that's the only way we can really, I want to say, become very competitive in this space. And next slide, Angela.
Yeah. And Jason, I'm going to interject there really quickly. I totally agree from the Tech Council's work. We brought in Chris Reisig, who's the head of the Renaissance Fund. We've had some work with the centrifuge folks, and so there's a room for a lot of different models in Wisconsin. And Badger Fund of Fund is one of them. Yep. So yeah, I think there's room for a lot more. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. And so here's where, guys, if you're looking on a slide, Eric, when I did this, I didn't include you in the model, but I would love to have Eric, Will, and Corey touch on their funds, their models, because I think when we're looking at this ecosystem here, here we have an opportunity to look at a lot of individuals who are in this space, who have different models, who have different investment theses that I think can, assist or play off of one another. And so with that said, Eric, let's go with you. And then Will, would you follow Eric about your fund?
Sure, thanks a lot. Appreciate the opportunity. And I very much appreciate being invited onto this panel. I have to say, so goes the notion that we are all better and smarter if we have more diverse inputs in our thinking. It's already playing itself out in this one, in the sense that we do have a very small sleeve within our PE portfolio for emerging managers. However, it's abundantly clear that that doesn't mean diverse managers. And I think that's exactly the way it has played out, where it is, in fact, a very small sleeve, a matter of a few $1,000,000. And what the idea, the premise there is that we are putting some dollars into, or willing to put some dollars into, some new managers, not new funds. We're making the distinction between a new fund and a new manager. I also want to make the distinction between private equity funds, hedge funds, and venture funds. And so emerging managers fund is very small, focused on venture capital. But I'm going to go back to my board and have a chat about whether we need to carve out some component for diverse managers. I would welcome that very much. Now, with that, what we've found is that when it comes to venture, emerging manager venture fund, that is a new manager of a fund, those funds are pretty small. And Corey, I know you're talking, you're talking $1 billion. I'm talking about a $20 million fund, a $30 million fund. And so it's a significantly smaller amount. But that means that with an aggregation of folk, you can probably pull a 15, 20, 25, $30 million fund together, because there is that kind of capital within the state with families and high net worth individuals and institutions. But what we found in that is that the emerging managers need some basis of experience for us to feel comfortable to put money into her or his fund. That is, they should at least be an entrepreneur, a successful one, so they have raised capital and built an enterprise, or they have received mentoring and perhaps been a junior person in another fund. Somebody who's had no experience either as an entrepreneur or in a venture fund of any kind, it's very difficult to bring yourself to let that person manage a bucket of money. So we owe it to a group of people to begin mentoring them, whether it's through fellowships or have them in other funds so that they can spawn out. But also, they don't have the network, because venture capital is all about relationships. And without the network for that person to manage money and tap into a network of people, it is a significant disadvantage. And again, I think fellowships and mentoring would build both experience and the network. Where WARF really is the game changer, though, is trying to do a better job of building the companies that come out of the university, and then working with UW-Milwaukee and Weiss's, so that we can develop new companies to invest in. Some of the emerging funds we've invested in have either had really poor performance, and what that does is it's going to hurt that person's future, because they're not going to be able to raise a second fund or a third fund. We've got to help people be successful in their first fund so that they can continue on. Or secondly, they wind up having to look outside the state for the investments. And I really don't want Wisconsin money to be poured out of the state to be supporting other companies, when really WARF's mission is to support things not just in the state, but more importantly for us, our mission and our IRS designation is technology spinouts from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I would love to put into motion a stronger program to mentor and mature diverse entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, people of color and otherwise, and to create the pipeline then that new emerging managers have things to invest in. And I think that would then create both a virtual circle, but also just a more robust community of business owners and the investors, so that the community as a whole is working collectively. It's pretty long-winded, sorry about that, but those are my thoughts.
No, I think that's great, Eric. Tom, if you don't mind, Will, you the first opportunity fund here in the state. You know how much of a genius I think you are, so.
Oh, well, I'll just stop there then. Thank you, Representative Fields and Secretary Nettles and Wisconsin Technology Council for this opportunity. It's a really wonderful conversation. So Badger State Opportunity Fund is the first statewide diversified multi-asset fund. And it really enables both institutional and individual investors to significantly reduce their state and federal capital gains tax liability, while in exchange making long-term investments in economically challenged areas of the state. So this is really, I think as Eric mentioned, about really trying to focus on ensuring Wisconsin's wealth helps fuel its economic future. That's precisely what this fund is established to do. And the scale that he discussed in terms of that $25 million scale, we're really talking about $15 to $25 million of capital gains that would be invested through the fund. There are 120 zones across the state of Wisconsin. I helped to select and nominate those areas. They are across 60 cities, towns, and villages here in 44 counties. And we really have three major goals in the process. Really is about mitigating those taxes. One can save up to 20% between federal and state capital gains liability. Generating 8 to 16% annual returns in a combination of both cash and appreciation. And with the ability for the appreciation over a 10-year period to have a zeroing out of its capital gains tax liability at the federal level. And then thirdly, looking at social return. Ultimately, this is about creating jobs in many of our areas that have not seen the kind of economic opportunity that some other communities have. So it's really a combination of those bottom line returns for folks. I'll just say lastly that this is an incredibly flexible tool in that it allows us to invest in both businesses, but also in commercial real estate. And one quick fact, we've got 28% of all of our opportunity zones are in communities that have a rental vacancy rate lower than San Francisco's. So you've got these incredibly tight markets where we need to be able to have our workers, we're going to work at these incredible companies, be closer to their jobs and become a part of the community. And the fund is one of the tools that can allow us to help create that kind of commercial real estate to support both the business itself as well as creating space for the workers to be closer and a part of those communities.
Okay.
Thank you, Will. Corey?
Sure, I'll be brief. So I launched Generation Growth Capital back around end of 06, beginning of 07. We are a traditional private equity buyout fund. We also do growth investing in some very select non-control positions. We are what's called a double bottom line fund, which means that in addition to making a market rate return on capital, we are also committed to generating social returns, which normally means investing in low to moderate income communities or having companies that are based in low to moderate income communities across our footprint, but also providing capital to underserved ethnic minority entrepreneurs. So we're a double bottom line fund, first market rate of return, and then social returns. We are generally institutional capital. Our investors are banks, insurance companies, corporations, and foundations. We have some high net worth individuals who are investing strategically with us. They bring other value beyond their capital, but 90–95% of our capital is generally sourced from institutional investors. We're currently investing out of our third fund, Generation Growth Capital Fund 3, and over a period of about 10 years across the three funds, we've raised, call it about just north of $100 million in capital. Our sweet spot now is really to be, as we're preparing for Fund 4, to be in that $50 to $75 million fund size range. We'll acquire 6 to 8 platform companies with that capital. We hold for 3 to 5 years and then harvest them. We've had very strong performance across our portfolio, current COVID challenges notwithstanding, and looking forward to to raising our next fund. So that's GGC.
Thanks, Corey. Thanks, guys. Angela, would you go to the next slide? One of the issues, and I think we've talked about it before, was some of the challenges facing emerging managers and diverse managers. And a lot of it is what we call the way the programs are implemented, it sort of sometimes weeds out those emerging and potential money managers who could really come into this plan, to this fund model. For example, when you look at geography, and nothing's wrong with this, but if you just limit it to, for example, my fund, if I say I'm just going to do Milwaukee businesses, well, that may put me in a tight niche. Although there are a number of, entrepreneurs in Milwaukee, if we're really looking at, a market rate return and really having a social impact fund, then I think you have to sort of deal with that restriction. Will these funds be flexible enough when they're looking for entrepreneurs and investors? So those are some of the, emerging and diverse manager programs that are challenges. And I'll say this, guys, because I think I need to express this. A lot of times, and Eric pointed to this, I know Pete pointed to this, John Neese has pointed to this. A lot of times this stuff is not racism or discrimination. If you do not have the contacts or the network, or there's bias in pattern recognition, meaning because of Jason Fields didn't go to Stanford or Harvard, you won't even look at me, there becomes the problem. And that's when we say, and I'm glad Corey touched on it, we are actually not doing our fiduciary responsibility as money managers because we are in essence leaving money on the table and we're not getting the best return for our buck. And so a lot of times, a lot of this is about, are we connected to a group of people? And what Eric was saying, and I think this is applicable in the state of Wisconsin, we need those individuals who would say, here, we will become a mentor, a pipeline. We will help grow our talent here in Wisconsin. Next slide, Angela. So again, some of the objectives of the Emerging Managers Program. Number one, generate appropriate risk-adjusted investment returns by identifying early stage funds with strong potential for success. I'd be remiss if I didn't say this and express this, but oftentimes we get put in a box, myself, Corey, Will, and I want to reiterate, we are not the black funds, right? We are funds who have the same objective goals as a lot of funds, make money, have a social impact, change the narrative. And so I don't want us to be put in this box because we are no different outside of when you look at maybe the assets under management and what our objective or our investment thesis is. Objective number two, access unique investment opportunities that may otherwise be overlooked. This goes back to, for example, if you look at the funds that the companies that I've invested in, 18 companies I want to say right now, we have 8 people of color, 9 people of color, 7 African Americans, 1 Latino, 1 Asian entrepreneur. A good majority of those are women. I want to say maybe 6 to 7 of those are women-owned companies. 5 to 6 are veteran-owned companies. And what happens is all these companies are doing well, but if you don't know where to look, and this is where we have to really deal with Wisconsin, and when we talk about that network and who do you know, one of the issues we have is that some of us have different pipelines. Some of us have different connections, and some of us are looking at different places. And so we can't leave that on the table because, again, we're leaving money on the table by not having diverse and emerging managers in a Wisconsin portfolio. Point number 3, cultivate the next generation. Again, Eric pointed to that. I think Pete and I have talked about that. And as Corey and Will believe, and as I do believe, and as many of you, Eric as well, provide access to capital for underserved communities. Will mentioned about jobs. He and Corey and I have talked about that. That'll be in one of the slides coming up. Next slide, please, Angela. Benefits of an emerging managers program. We talked about this. Emerging managers may have to be small in size, much more nimble. They're able to, I want to say, exploit market inefficiencies. And so those are the things that we're looking at as far as the benefits or the value added of emerging and diverse fund managers. We are able to tap into market niches that would allow us to exploit those inefficiencies. Anybody want to comment on that? Okay. Next slide, Angela. And I believe this is a slide that I got from my dear brother, Pete Dolcamere. And Pete and I talked about this. And here's where these emerging and diverse managers come in. When you're talking about impact investing, and not just Milwaukee, but even in Wisconsin, we cannot, in the state of Wisconsin, have Milwaukee remain number 9 on this list. I'm gonna allow you all to take this in. From 2012 to 2017, we are at number 9 as far as growing job markets. Funds like Corey's, Will's, mine's, a few other people, when we talk about impact investing, this is one of the areas that we are trying to, again, change the narrative. One of the things that I liked about what Eric says, and I'm going to keep coming back to this, is when you look at what's happening in Wisconsin, in the Midwest, and Pete talks about this as well, we have to change the narrative. When you look at the political rhetoric, and we all know it, when you look at all these things that are happening, Kenosha, Milwaukee, guys, if we don't change the narrative, then what are we really doing? And when you have emerging and diverse funds who have an objective of helping to change that narrative, then we can begin to look at numbers like this 6.1%, and we can move Milwaukee from the slowest to one of the fastest in that columns. Next slide, Angela, please. Again, my brother Pete Dolcamera, this is one of the slides he gave us when we talked about a rising tide lifts all boats, and Pete touched on it. How can we begin to change the narrative for urban areas, for African Americans, people of color? When you look at this, and what I love about all the guys on this is everyone here thinks big. And so why shouldn't we be in a position to create urban unicorns in Wisconsin? Whether it's through the Badger Fund, the private equity fund, the VC fund, why shouldn't we be in a position to do that? And the only way we can do that is you have to have the funds here that have those strategies and networks and connections and mentorship, like Eric said, that will empower people to be successful. If we line all those things up, we can get here. Pete and I believe this. I know Corey and Will and Eric, we all believe this. If we do these things, it is very possible that we will create urban unicorns in Wisconsin. Next slide, please. And this, I believe is the last slide, and we can get into the discussion, Tom. This is a list of supporters and allies that I've had conversations with who are believing and growing that, listen, we actually need to do something like this, whether it be a government-sponsored program, whether it be private sector. The reality is that we need to do something, and there's no time like the present where there's an opportunity for the Wisconsin Technology Council. Everyone on this webinar can get plugged in and determine how do we change the narrative and go to the next level. And I believe, Angela, that may be the last slide.
Very good.
Tom, your show.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Corey, and others for commenting as we went through. I'm going to start with a question for Eric. And by the way, for those who are tuned in, feel free to lob your questions in through chat. Eric, you said something very significant, that you plan to approach your board of directors about a carve out for with diverse fund managers. And so I want to make the point that you know this space very well. I mean, one of the great talents you brought to Wisconsin was you helped stand up the venture fund for the Gates Foundation. And during that time, what was your experience, not only with emerging funds, because it was new for Gates to do this, but also diverse funds, because you were working around the world, especially in health-related areas. What are your thoughts on return on investment during that time?
Well, you know, Tom, let me start here. Just an anecdote, because it's when an African American person sits in the middle of an all-white room. You know, the last panel you had me on was all women except me, this solo guy. And now you have me as a solo white man and among a bunch of African American leaders. Thank you. I mean, it really, I am getting smarter by every panel you have me on, Tom. So keep signing me up.
We're going to look for something else that'll put you on the spot.
No, it's great. I love it. I actually love it. You know, it's a great question, Tom. As far as our thought processes vis-a-vis getting a more diverse set of individuals running funds, running companies. As you know, I built the first vaccine biotech on the continent of Africa, hired all Africans to run it. This is going to be very odd, Tom, but it never came into the equation. We just didn't think of it that way. It was, you use the human beings who were appropriate in the context, And whether you're building a fund or you're building a company in Africa or Southeast Asia or even in the United States, you found the best person to do the job. And it wasn't, and more times than not, you wound up either with a person of color running it or a person of color who was part of the team. But it wasn't as conscious as you might think. It just was what it was. And they were the best people to run the show. Yeah. And so it was this is almost a silly thing to say, but it was almost just being colorblind. You just didn't care. You weren't thinking about it. They were great people, men, women, African Americans, just Black people around the world, Indians, South Americans, the Hispanics, the Southeast Asians. It wasn't a conscious factor that played into it. And it was by definition a double bottom line, or a triple bottom line if you want to throw environmental impact into it. That has certainly been my career. And then coming into Wisconsin, I suggest Wisconsin, certainly this southeastern corridor is more diverse than people give it credit for. We just have to tap into that. Mm-hmm. And as Jason was noting, if I was to build a fund, I wouldn't even know how to tap into some of those communities. And so I would need my friends on this panel to help me recognize it. And I think that's where a fundamental flaw is that without the willingness to expand your network to include people who just simply have different vantage points, you will never see it. Mm-hmm. And so it has to be a purposeful step to expand your vantage point and your friendship network, and then share that so you can identify opportunities. So again, Tom, I'm learning with every panel you put me on. So thank you.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Eric. And this could be for anyone because it was embodied in the slides a bit. It's been embodied in some comments so far. There are a number of larger funds, perhaps even some pension funds, especially around the Midwest, that have invested almost everywhere but the Midwest is sometimes the way I read the data on that. Yet I'm also seeing, and we see it with our early stage symposium coming up, a lot of interest by out-of-state VCs, especially around the Midwest, and taking a look at what's going on in Wisconsin. In fact, we have a record number, even during this pandemic, who are signed up to be a part of our early stage in November. So what's happening with those pension funds? Is that part of the problem, both with emerging funds, and again, they're not necessarily the same, diverse funds? Is it a matter of capital flowing out of the Midwest in general? So thoughts on that, and maybe I'll start with Corey, because I know he's got a great overview, not only in this state, but as he looks around the country.
I mean, part of the challenge is, the Midwest has been generally viewed as a flyover region, and the capital has been on both coasts. Some of that is the real or perceived opportunity set, both in terms of managers, but also in terms of deal flow. So the capital has sort of flowed to where that opportunity is. I think a lot of people are more recently coming to think about investing in the Midwest because they understand that it is a more inefficient, a more underserved market. So you go to the coast, the valuations on the coast for those assets are substantially higher than if you're investing in a biotech company in Madison, or an IT firm in Minneapolis, or a services firm in Chicago. So some people are beginning to slowly discover, the Midwest and what the opportunity set here, and how the inefficiencies that exist in the Midwest create an opportunity for outsized investment. But generally, that's not been the case. There is a certain sort of herd mentality among investors generally. And everybody wants to do what everybody else has done because it's perceived as less risky. And when something goes wrong, you look less like a fool because you were doing what everybody else was doing. Again, as a person who wears an investment fiduciary hat, my job isn't to do what everybody else is doing. My job is to look for alpha. And generally, you find alpha in inefficient, underserved investment opportunities. And whether that's in managers, whether that's regions, whether that's sectors, that's really what we have to be looking for. So I hope as people get their mind focused on alpha and inefficiency, that will tip the Midwest up as an opportunity, and it will further highlight emerging and diverse managers.
Mm-hmm. That's a key point about the opportunity that is here. Others on that question regarding sort of some of the behavior of what I would say maybe Midwest pension funds tending to look elsewhere first.
Will, this is something you and I have talked about a great deal.
Yeah,
So,
I was waiting for you to say something about it.
I wasn't going to let you get away with not addressing this.
Well, if you'd like to, Representative, otherwise I'm happy to.
By all means, go ahead.
Okay, all right. So I know Representative Fields and I talked about, how great the opportunity zones legislation is, what a incredible tool it can be. And we found a great example where the state of Wisconsin actually had stepped up to invest in opportunity zones. It just happened to be also an opportunity fund run by an African-American operated firm. But the investment is in Florida. So literally it just happened just before the pandemic started off. And it was at the scale of about $100 million in one set of complexes in Florida. You think about, now in comparison, what would $100 million worth of investment in Wisconsin's economically challenged areas, when you think about our cities, towns, and villages that have not seen as much growth, but certainly have that potential. And as Corey mentioned about just these inefficiencies, when you have an opportunity to look at applying a public-private partnership where the municipalities really engage, where the state has tools, and where that can actually be added to the private sector, both mitigating their taxes and having return, that's an incredible place for the pension fund to come in and really help fuel the economic growth of the state of Wisconsin. And ensuring that all parts of the state are rising, not just these certain areas that have been growing. You want to make sure, just as you would with a healthy heart, that all the chambers are firing. You'd want to make sure that all of the state of Wisconsin is growing equitably, and that we're taking advantage of really the low-hanging fruit in these economically challenged areas.
Very good, very good. Let me turn back to Corey for a question, that something you mentioned during the slides when we were going through there about the performance of diverse funds. And as you said, there are some theories behind why that is, but you said, that it's part of the fiduciary duty of people who are investing money to consider that, given those kinds of performances. And so I want to get a little more into the why. I mean, is it because they tend to be smaller, younger, hungrier, or looking for deals in those places where others are not looking, and so therefore they've got a lot to pick from, or perhaps a combination?
You nailed, all of the major regions or all the major theories, Tom. First and foremost, this is about inefficiencies.
Okay.
So you're about underserved markets, underserved entrepreneurs, these are communities that have just been ignored. And because of that, where my multiples in my transactions may be 5 times, others may be 7, 8, 9, 10 times, particularly if you move it out to the coast. So some of it, I think, is just what's latent with the inefficiencies. People are tapping different networks. So if I'm pardon the expression, a middle-aged white guy in the private equity space, I'm in the same circles, in the same schools, in the same markets as everybody else looking at the same deals. Part of the inefficiency of this is that I'm talking to entrepreneurs in Terre Haute, Indiana, and in Gary, Indiana, and in Beloit or wherever. So I'm fishing in a different pond as a general rule than everybody else is. And that means that I'm able to exploit an inefficiency that others aren't, first and foremost. But then there is a bunch of, theory and maybe some social data on younger, hungrier, folks who haven't created their wealth yet. They're not as complacent yet. They're just at a different point in their social and their economic life cycle where they're trying to create and amass wealth. Their perception and their tolerance for risk is greater. Even if you look at entrepreneurs, After people get to be 35 and 40, there's a huge drop off in entrepreneurial risk taking in terms of people starting businesses. So I think there are those social factors that are at work here in terms of younger, hungrier, greater appetite for risk. But I also think it comes down to people are sourcing deals in different networks than everybody else is, just based upon their backgrounds and their pedigrees.
Yeah.
Tom, can I add a
Absolutely.
in here? You know, we're talking about predominantly private equity and venture funds. And we know that there are a lot of entrepreneurs, women and minority-owned entrepreneurs in this state. There is a disconnect, however, of entrepreneurs who are tech-focused. That is, I think the STEM community is woeful in being represented by people of color and women. I think we know the STEM fields lack those individuals, but those are the technologies that the venture funds are looking to invest in. And so you wind up with a whole lot of entrepreneurs who are people of color, but venture funds don't, may not be investing in retail or restaurants and those kinds of things. And so I think this focus today is on the money manager side, but I do think we have a lot of work to do in mentoring and growing entrepreneurs generally, but then even more so growing and mentoring entrepreneurs in the tech fields, so those venture funds have people to invest in locally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Eric, and I would agree with that completely. The cautionary note that I would sound is that when you talk to those women and minority entrepreneurs in technology, they will tell you they have a terrible time getting capitalized. So this whole lack of access to capital, even when you're in traditional VC spaces and technology, those entrepreneurs, and it's been well documented, the data is well studied, et cetera, they have major headwinds in accessing capital. I'm involved in an effort right now in Wisconsin where I'm working with a young African-American woman who's starting a fund to support those kinds of entrepreneurs because there are issues of capital. We're a double bottom line fund. One of our missions is to provide capital to ethnic minority entrepreneurs because we understand that they have challenge all over the capital structure from debt to equity and beyond accessing capital. So even when we have, the entrepreneurs, and I have friends who've been entrepreneurs in technology spaces, both African-American men and women, they all still have the same challenges about accessing capital.
Thanks, Corey.
Very good. So, one of the sort of time-honored, I think, or hurdles that a lot of people face is, if you don't have experience, you can't get a job, but you can't get the experience unless you have a job. And that kind of translates, it seems to me, as well into the investment world. We talked about that a little bit. And this is not just diverse managers, but emerging managers. It's unless you've had at least one fund that you've successfully pulled off, you're perhaps not going to be, working with others. And now I was thinking, for example, we talked a little bit about the Badger Fund of Funds. Great example right now, they've set out deliberately to hire first-time managers. That's basically all they have, except for Rock River Capital has got a little more experience there, but basically these are all young managers. And I know I think they've invested in, I bet it's close to 30 firms now. How does that rub against that notion that, you got to have experience before you get that next round? Let anybody take this. I know everybody's touched on it a little bit.
I'll chime in on it. I mean, I think there are a few things that we have to look at, and one is when I started my fund and being a legislator, so there are things that I had to navigate there. But one of the things, and Eric, you're right when you say I look to start my fund in areas AI, STEM, things of that nature. In addition to some other ones, we function more like a generalist. But one of the problems that I ran into was a lot of people that I would have personally put money behind, they left Wisconsin. I mean, you're talking about African-American men who were, AI companies, VR virtual reality companies. They moved to either the West Coast or the East Coast. To Corey's point, it was just a difficult time getting into that network and getting capital, which was one of the reasons why I started my fund. Now, as a person who's looking to, raise money, you run into, I think, the things that Will and I talked about. Here you have an example where the state of Wisconsin Investment Board, instead of investing in their backyard like we all believe they should, they went to Florida. So, and I don't know how long, Corey, you and I have been talking and trying to have SWIB invest money into emerging managers here and diverse managers here. But I'd be remiss to say that it is very difficult, because you have to do what we're doing now. I think educating a lot of people, and quite honestly, you have to have people like Eric who will say, this is good for business. It's not just the right thing to do, but it also makes sense from a fiduciary responsibility. Because a lot of times what we're hit with is, in order to, for example, I'm dealing with the city of Milwaukee saying we need to look at emerging and diverse managers. One of the opposition statements will be, well, what does that have to do with my fiduciary responsibility? Well, if you don't know that emerging and diverse managers can exploit market efficiencies and actually gain a higher return, you're sort of not being the best fiduciary. And so there are a lot of things that I think we have to deal with, which is, I think this is the process that we're dealing with now, educating and getting past some of the biases and some of the myths that emerging and diverse managers, number one, won't have the performance. And I think it is, and number two, we really have to get to the connection. How do we bring, like what you're doing now, Tom, how do we bring all these people together to have this real discussion to say we're leaving money on the table, we're leaving opportunities on the table if we really want to make Wisconsin competitive? And so it's very tough, because as a fund manager, you're consistently hit with people trying to get over the biases. You're consistently hit with, I think internally people look at us as the black funds, and I've always said that is not what we are. And then secondly, it is do you really want to have the impact to make Wisconsin global? Because if you do, all of us have connections in playing sandboxes that the traditional guys don't play in. Mm-hmm. Long way to answer that question.
Okay, no, thank you.
Can I just add one other thing? I want to come where this panel started, and that's with a note from your sponsor. People whom I do not know said something that was extremely compelling. If you want to change the world, all you have to do is change your mind. And I think this whole conundrum about access to capital, and you have to have the job and experience before you can get the job with experience, I think we have to reevaluate how we approach, first-time fund managers, first-time investors. And the traditional way of saying you have to have done it this way and you have to come out of a fund and then the team gets lifted out of a fund, if we continue to do what we've always done, we're going to get what we've always got. So we have to change our mind about the way we assess and value talent and make predictions about people's future success. I started out my fund with institutional capital. I had zero track record, but I was able to go to those institutional investors and say, you knew me over in this context as a lawyer or as a commerce secretary, take a risk on me doing this new thing. And I'm going to put some resources and some people around me who've done this before who will help de-risk my failure on the operations side. And I was thankful that I had people put, $25 million or so behind me to do that. But they were willing to change their mind, to change my outcome. So I think if we're really going to start to get any traction on these issues, we have to change our mind about how we see and value people and their prospects for success.
And Tom, let me let you know, so when I called Corey, let him know what I was doing, and I asked Corey, how did you get in? And he told me he said that exact story to you all. Here's what it did for me. It moved me past the fear of being this expert already. Mm-hmm. And it played on the fact that I have something to offer our community to bring it up. Had he not told me that, I would have still been hindered by I don't know if I should go do this because people keep telling me, well, you have this to overcome, you have that to do. And so I agree with them. And as a personal person who he testified and told that to, it encouraged me, as I know he and Will do a lot of others, to get in this space to, number one, generate market returns, but at number two, have an impact on Wisconsin, not just urban areas, but on Wisconsin. And I think we can't forget that, because Will, and chime in on this, you mentioned places like Ashland where your fund could be crazy beneficial to.
Right, right. A perfect example is, and it's not about race, and I'm glad that we've repeatedly said that today. Places like Marinette, where they have a 0 rental vacancy rate, and we've talked about just how crushing it is that we've got folks who are commuting 45 minutes, an hour one way to a job. You've got, Marinette is going to pick up about 1,000 net new jobs, no additional housing for them. It's a great opportunity for both the state of Wisconsin and the private sector to both reduce, increase return, but also reduce taxes on the private sector side to create workforce housing there. 1,000 new jobs and no additional housing there. We should be looking at, in addition, we have a series of places around the state with mom and pop CNC shops and others where, the baby boomer is ready to retire. Many of those shops, especially on the western side of the state, there's nobody in place to buy that. Yet no one's talked to the employees to ask whether or not they'd be interested in buying the company, or whether there are millennials who would like to come into these communities. You can take a package where the community actually helps through the municipality, providing some equity. At the same time, we're looking at private sector or the state investing on top of it. It allows us to retain those jobs. It allows us to recapitalize the business so that they can actually get state-of-the-art tools and equipment, and potentially improve the facilities so that they can actually be worldwide competitors, all because of the ability to bring in lower cost capital with a higher return.
Yeah. And indeed, for the benefit of our listeners on that, Marinette, that's because of the shipbuilding contract.
Exactly.
Has brought in a lot of activity into that community.
And that's just one example around the state.
Yeah, Tom, can I just add a statement? I know we're going long.
Yeah.
I'm going to pick up on something Corey said that's really resonating. It's going to make me think for a while. When we pick money managers in our investment portfolio, you first and foremost look at prior performance. You just have to. That's what you go by. And then you look at it again, you look at it again, you look at it again. Corey, your point was, yeah, but wait a minute. I would have not been in this situation if that's what everybody based it on. You then went to a comment of you surrounded yourself with people to help de-risk the investment. Tom, you led into this by noting that Badger Funds of Funds and the Rock River guys, they had no venture investment experience, but they were, certainly Andy was a successful entrepreneur, and he had a network of people that he tapped into, venture capitalists and otherwise. He raised money, and he was also had a heck of a network in the military. Corey, what I'm picking up on you say is, whether you change the narrative or you change your perspective, you have to build a level of trust and take that leap, but there better be some kind of safety net if you're going to do that. And that is, if you're going to invest in somebody who has no entrepreneurial or investment experience, that person better surround herself or himself with a lot of people with the network and support mechanism to be mentored through that process. Otherwise, you're really just making an investment out of pure hope, and goodwill. So, and that's not wise either. So, Corey, thank you for your comments. That really resonated with me, and I'm going to think about that quite a bit.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eric. Well said as always. Well, I want to thank this group for being with us today. Jason, Eric, William, and Corey, and also Pete Delcamar from Kimberly-Clark, who is doing some wonderful things, not only within that company, but around the state as well. So thanks to all for being a part of it. Angela, if we can move to this closing slide quickly. I mentioned the early stage symposium earlier. We're going to hear from John Jakes on November 10th. He's going to open that up for us. Our Excellence in Entrepreneurial Education Award this year is going to go to Lori Keating Heineman. As many of you know Lori from a variety of walks of life, right? I mean, but now she's running Madison Development Corporation and doing some great things there. So we're really excited about that. As I noted, we have about 50 investor groups that are taking part in investor intros. This is all virtual, by the way. And then we had 80 company applications. And for those who think Wisconsin doesn't have enough good companies, I hope and believe that we're on our way to having more all the time. And then we're going to have a great, we're using a platform that's going to be very visual, we even got avatars. Right now, my team has put me inside a tree in my avatar. So I'm literally inside a tree. So that's what they think of me, right? So anyway, we're going to have a lot of chance to really showcase some companies. So plenty of time to register. Thanks again to this great group. And as we move ahead, this isn't the end of it, right? I mean, we're going to be talking about this. We're going to be pursuing this in a lot of different ways. So thank you all for being a part. Again, Corey, Eric, Will, and Jason. All right, take care, everybody, and we're going to see you all soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks, Tom. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.